nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now where many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people live. I also want to acknowledge that Toronto is covered by the Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. I also want to thank the co-sponsors for today's event, which are the Edmonton Public Library, the Milton, Ontario Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. We really want to thank our co-sponsors. The series on why whistleblowers matters is a really important one in a democratic society, because a genuine democracy depends both on everyone's free expression rights as well as their rights to hear and to know, which is why a free press is so important, which is why having a right to information, good access to information legislation and practices in the society. But it's also why whistleblower protection, protection for those who speak up in the public interest, is also so vital, because they inform us about things they see in their workplace or elsewhere, as we saw during the pandemic in long-term care homes, about illegal or unjust or illicit, unsafe, fraudulent, or otherwise harmful practices that the public should know about so we can do something about it. Unfortunately, whistleblowers typically face very serious retaliation for having the courage to speak up. And that's why good whistleblower protection laws are important to not only halt the retaliation, but to remedy it should it happen. Unfortunately, in a recent survey of the whistleblower protection legislation in about 50 countries worldwide, Canada's legislation came dead last. Absolutely the worst in the world. This is a serious problem. So we want to illustrate the issues that whistleblowers, prominent Canadian whistleblowers, have shared with the public, the importance of those issues, as well as let you hear from them as the challenges they face, so we can think together about how we can do something about this and provide the proper protection for those who act in the public interest. Before we go any further, I'd like to talk about the procedure. I'm going to be having a conversation with our guest today, following which we're going to turn to you, the audience, to join it. So my conversation is going to go on for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to turn to you. If you have any questions you'd like to ask of our guest, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. At any point during the conversation, if a question comes to mind that you would like to ask for more information, or a question other than the ones I'm asking, just write down your question as you think of it on that Q&A tab. And when we get to the audience portion of this conversation, I'll turn to Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the Center for Free Expression, who's monitoring the Q&A, and ask her to share with us to read the first question, at which time our guest will have a chance to respond to it. So I'd like to now introduce our guest today, one of the truly important and prominent Canadian whistleblowers. Her name is Janet Merlo. Janet was an Rcmp agent for nearly 20 years. And as we know now, thanks in large part to Janet, we know about the problems and challenges that she, as a woman in the Rcmp, faced. The kind of systemic harassment, bullying, gender discrimination, and gender violence. She spoke up about it effectively and at great personal cost. In 2012, she wrote a book describing it called No One to Tell, Breaking My Silence on Life in the Rcmp. And she also became the lead plaintiff in a class action suit that started out with a handful of women, as you'll hear shortly, and ultimately involved several thousands of women who had been employees of the Rcmp. And the federal government was forced to pay a settlement of more than $125 million as a result of the harassment and discrimination and gender violence faced by women in the Rcmp. Janet's courage shone a very bright spotlight on a terrible problem in Canada's national police force. that we as a country still have not adequately dealt with. So Janet, it's a real pleasure to have you with us today, and I look forward to our conversation about what's happened and where we can go, and why at the end of the day, whistleblowers really do matter. So could we begin just by, could you just tell us a little about yourself, where you're from, and how you came to join the RCMP?
Hi, thank you very much for the nice introduction. I'm originally from Newfoundland. I grew up in a small fishing community called Harbor Grace, and went to Memorial University after high school and studied sociology and criminology. And I always knew I wanted to work in corrections. I just was never sure what direction that would be. But my friend in the dorm wanted to go and write the entrance test to the RCMP, so I went with her for moral support. I hadn't really given it any thought, and then the guy asked if I was writing the test, and I said, no, I'm just here for moral support. And he said, oh, you probably couldn't pass it anyway. So I wrote it. I accepted the challenge.
Thank you.
And then, then as the process, I passed the test, and then as the process went through, I got thinking maybe the front end of corrections, the frontline first responder method is the way I need to go. So I went to training in 1991. So yeah.
Was your training in Regina?
It was, yeah, Regina, Saskatchewan.
And then after that, where was your first posting?
I went to Nanaimo on Vancouver Island after that.
Okay, and as I understand, you spent a lot of your career there?
Yes, my whole career, actually. Yeah.
So when did you get the first indications that you, as a woman, or other of your fellow officers who are women, were treated differently?
Probably from day one.
Okay.
In our marching, in our drill practices, we would have to learn how to march, of course, in sync and to a certain step. And the corporal would yell out, what was the worst year in the history of the RCMP? And as we were supposed to keep our cadence and keep marching, we were to yell back, 1974, Corporal. And then he'd bellow out, why was that the worst year in the history of the RCMP? And we were expected to say, because that's the first year women were allowed in, Corporal. And the way it went from there.
So, I mean, you encountered this right even as you were a trainee.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Was anything said about this? I mean, that's outrageous.
You know, they justify it in saying that, you know, they insult you and they bring you down and they break you down to toughen you up, to make you ready for what life is going to deliver to you on the street. And you don't want to be out in public with someone screaming at you and get upset by that. So they want you to toughen up a little bit. But in hindsight, you know, it wasn't the public we had to be afraid of. It was in-house. And yeah, so they tend to try to break you down so they can build you up to what they want you to be. And yeah, therein lies a big part of the problem, I think.
They were breaking down women differently than they were breaking down men, it seems.
I think so, yeah, for sure.
So
we had to do twice the amount of work.
So then after you finished training, you went to Nanaimo for your first posting. What was your work there?
It kind of was a continuation of what had started. One of my first supervisors had a naked life-size blow-up doll sex toy that he would inflate during our night shifts. And when any of the women went into his office to put in our files for reading, he would ask the women to stand next to the blow-up doll, because he said he wanted to compare our statures. And that was very well known. That was just something he did almost every night.
So so he was the sergeant where you were?
He was the watch commander on my shift.
So was his boss aware of this?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone in the building knew about his blow-up doll.
And no one would say anything to him about it?
No.
So that must have made the working relationship a little bit challenging.
Absolutely. Like I worked with one girl actually who saved up all her annual leave, all her lieu time, bank time, any kind of time off she had, and all her money. And one year she kind of disappeared for a few weeks on vacation. So everybody thought, And when she came back, she had, on her own dime and on her own, using up her holidays as recovery time, she had gone and gotten a breast reduction. So the guys in the office would leave her alone. And that's the extent that she went through because she was hounded all the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, it leaves me almost speechless to hear those stories. And the fact that nobody did anything about it. Did that,
No.
so that continued, I take it, for that kind of thing?
Oh, for years. Yeah, I had sex toys left in we all had a cabinet where we had our kit bag, we call it, and that's what we take out on the road in our car with our tickets and our court appearance notices and all our things we need for work. And yeah, I'd often find sex toys in there, or one supervisor used to leave a vacuum cleaner attachment with a note on it. It's long and black and thick. Take it home and have fun with it on days off. So I'd find it, I'd rip the note off and I put the thing back in the janitor's cupboard and just, yeah, did that all the time till I started keeping the notes.
And again, I mean, this was known that this kind of behavior is going on and just nothing done about it?
Yeah, it was standard operating procedure, basically. You were just conditioned to put up and shut up, smile and nod and continue on with your day.
So how did these kinds of things affect you in these early days?
Well, I think as an officer, like trying to learn your role and trying to, build up your confidence and your self-awareness and stuff, I think it really chips away at you. And it did for me, to know that, to think that the men that I should have looked up to and inspired to be, those who were higher ranking than me, to think that they were laughing and talking that way, it really beats you down to think that they're not only doing it, if they're doing it to your face, what the hell are they doing behind your back, and that insecurity, that really plays on your ability to do your job.
Was it an environment where at least the women officers could get together and talk about what was going on, or not?
The odd part in all of this is nobody talked about it, because I think everybody, the really blatant things were done more on a one-on-one basis, where there wasn't a whole lot of witnesses, or, a lot of it was done in the office and heard by many. But some of the more serious stuff, and we all thought that we were alone. I thought I was alone when I was in the change room. I didn't say anything because nobody else was saying anything, and we all just didn't know. And one of my last appearances in court in Vancouver, there was 7 women from Nanaimo there who had come to support me in court. And we all just stood and cried because we all didn't really know, because we'd never talked about it.
Right. So there wasn't sort of sharing of experiences, whatever. The atmosphere was such that you really just had to cope with it yourself.
Yeah, because you think you're the only one. You think you're the weak one that they're picking on, and
Right.
they're picking on you because you're weak. And then that breaks you a little bit. So you don't want to appear weak to others or tell them what's happening, because maybe they're not experiencing it. But, in hindsight, if we had all just talked, we would have maybe been that support for each other, but nobody knew.
Well, and it's easy to say in hindsight, isn't it? But at the time, I can imagine that feeling of isolation. And
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then you try so hard, to get a course or something, and yeah, no, it's not given to the women, because the women are just going to get pregnant and go on mat leave, and so we'll give it to the guys because they're going to be here actually working.
So were there a lot of little things like that, little perks or little options that your bosses could hand out that got differentially given to men as opposed to women?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Every year there'd be courses, there'd be a budget for courses to be offered. And, they would send out a list of courses, and before emails and stuff, it was all printed up and put in your locker. And mine one year had a list of courses for women attached to the top page. And it was just all these very insulting, condescending type courses that were available for women if they wanted them. And yeah, it's, you know, like, no, women know when to stop nagging your husband. And yes, your ass looks big in those jeans, get over yourself. And how to drive, how to use the gas and brake pedals in a car for women. And yeah, it just, and then you don't want to look at the second page because you think, oh, you know, like, you're just so exhausted mentally and emotionally that, you know. And then a lot of us didn't get the courses. A lot of the guys did.
So, I mean, did you have the sense at the time this was just something that was happening in your detachment, or?
Well, I knew from training that there was that mindset. I knew from my criminology and sociology degree, you know, I didn't go into policing blindly. I knew I was going into a men's organization, or predominantly male, and I knew there would be challenges to that. But so yeah, I knew that that Nanaimo probably wasn't the only detachment, but you know, God forbid if you speak up, it's going to be career suicide. So you just put up and shut up until you break, and then they turn it around and try to make you look like the bad person, you know.
So, I mean, at some point you did feel the pressure and took some action. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, after about 15 years, I guess, I'd had enough. And I was starting, my mental health was starting to get bad, and I was, you know, my marriage was starting to have problems, and it was just all reaching a boiling point. So I wrote an internal memo to the officer in charge of the Nanaimo detachment, and just bringing up some issues and outing some issues. And yeah, that was the beginning of the end for me. Shortly after that, we worked blocks of 48 hours. So we'd work 2-day shifts, 2 12-hour days, and then switch and do 2 12-hour nights. And then we'd have 4 days off. So at the end of my last night shift, one morning at 6 o'clock, I was getting ready to go home, and my watch commander told me I couldn't leave the building because I had a staffing interview that day. Someone from staffing services was coming, and I needed to stay. So I hung around. I was exhausted, and we didn't have a union. So I never had a union rep. I never had anybody that I could call and say, hey, I've been blindsided by this interview. Can you come sit with me, you know, or help out? And so I went upstairs and went to this staffing meeting, and they told me I was done in Nanaimo, that I was being transferred to the Lower Mainland. And that would mean leaving my husband and kids, because he was a municipal employee at the police station. He couldn't transfer. And our kids were young, and they were settling into their school and their home and their life. And I knew that transfer was punitive. So yeah, that was the beginning of the end. And he said no one wanted to work with me, and no one respected me, and just total. I was absolutely broken when I left that interview. And
this was after you had started speaking up or raising issues, is that correct?
yeah, that was after I'd sent that memo, and yeah, it was bad. And I the next week when I went back for my next block, my sergeant on my watch, he just kind of grinned, and he said, how was your staffing interview? And I said, horrible. I went home in crying, like I was in tears. And he said, yeah, that was their attempt to get you to quit. So that's what they do. And I spoke out, and I wrote the letter, and I angered those at the top because of my letter. And then the punitive response was the transfer. So I fought the transfer, and I wrote the then commissioner of the Rcmp. I went over all their heads, and I wrote him and begged him to, you know, if they didn't want me in Nanaimo, just put me in an adjoining detachment where I could drive home every night. That's all I wanted, something within commuting distance. And I begged him for help, and I did hear back. I got a letter back in the mail 25 months later.
25 months?
25 months. I wrote the commissioner begging for help in August of 2007. And I got a letter back in September of 2009 telling me how seriously they took complaints of harassment in the RCMP and promised a full investigation. So,
I mean, if you were writing a fictional movie script, people would think it unrealistic.
yeah. And I don't know in what organization you can write somebody and they can actually send you back a letter 25 months later. I just don't understand how that's even acceptable, but that's the reality.
So then what happened? I mean, you were getting in a more and more difficult situation. It's affecting your personal life. What happened next?
One day we were really short-staffed, which was ongoing all the time, and it was budget cuts and it was, not bringing people in. So we were working below the minimums. And another member and I went to a domestic where the lady was really badly hurt. And it could have been dealt with a lot easier and without her being so hurt if there had been enough people working that day.
Right.
And she actually suffered brain damage because every time he would chase her down the hall of the building, every time he would catch her, he would slam her head into the wall. And there was only me waiting for backup. I wasn't allowed to go in by myself. You're not allowed. You have to wait. And then by the time we got in there to intervene. So the next day I was writing up the file and I just had a meltdown and I got up from my desk and I yelled out, I think I'm losing my effing mind. And I walked out and I went to my doctor the next day and started telling her what was going on and how bad it had gotten. When I'd go into work, we had a keypad at the back door to let us in, and I'd key in my code and I'd run to the women's change room where I would throw up. That was my physical reaction to going to work. I would throw up. My hair was falling out in clumps, and my doctor put me on stress leave at that point, and I never went back. They did an investigation. They investigated themselves thoroughly for 2 years, and they came back with a final report that said absolutely nothing happened. There was no harassment. Nobody witnessed anything. Nobody saw anything. And that was in conflict with some of the women who had reached out to me and said, oh, hey, I was interviewed about your complaint today. And yeah, I told them my story. And I heard that from a few women. And then it came out, the final report came out and said nobody had seen anything. Nobody witnessed anything. Sorry, you feel the way you do. Thanks for showing up. That's it. File concluded. And yeah, and there was at least 7 others that were going through the same thing. And I asked for those statements. I said, well, where are the statements of the women who told their stories? And they were never provided. I went looking for them through the Freedom of Information Act, and it was denied. I never ever got to see those statements, even though it was my investigation, and I should have had a right to see what was coming in.
Yes, indeed. So then, you were off on leave. You got this report back where they said that the force had done nothing wrong. So what happened next?
Then my doctors recommended a medical discharge. I had some surgeries and a bit of a cancer scare, and yeah, my doctor, and I had started seeing a psychologist and a psychiatrist trying to get some mental health help, and they recommended that I never go back. They said it was too toxic. So they all agreed that medical discharge from the RCMP would be in order. And that's what happened in March of 2010.
But it was only a couple of years later that you ended up writing a book about all this. So how did you go from being medically discharged to deciding to write a book?
Well, around the same time that I was discharged, we separated. Well, we had separated, and the divorce was happening, and they had gone after my ex. He worked at the police station, and when I went off on stress leave, they went after him quite hard, and that was rough on us and was rough on him, and it was rough on me seeing them kind of punish him because I had spoken up, and he shouldn't have had to deal with all that. But so yeah, I got used to
Could I just ask
Oh,
for clarification? For those of us from Ontario and from certain other parts of the country, might think a police station was a municipal police station separate from the RCMP. But that wouldn't be the case, would it, in Nanaimo?
no, not in most detachments across Canada, actually, for the RCMP. The RCMP will contract to the municipality for policing, and then the municipality will supply the building, the support staff, and then the RCMP brings in its members and its cars and its equipment. But the support staff are generally civilian employees, or in my ex's case, a municipal employee.
But he was under the direction, I mean, he was under the direction of or at least he was working with the RCMP officers who were staffing that station.
Yeah, they did have a municipal manager that managed the municipal employees at the detachment, but a lot of them are intimidated by the RCMP, and or their ex-RCMP members retired who get these jobs as municipal managers, and it continues. So yeah, there's
So
not.
your husband was feeling the pressure as a result of their going after you.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they were name calling him. They would the cell block was in the basement, so they would call down and say, "Hey, faggot, put coffee on. We're coming down for coffee." And then his nickname was Piss On or something like that. They'd call him, and yeah, it got really bad. So we divorced, and it wasn't until I just kind of fell silent. I was just done, burnt out, single mom now, and trying to muck through with my girls. And then I saw Catherine Galliford on CBC one night doing an interview about the harassment that she had experienced.
Tell us who Catherine Galford is.
Well, Catherine, a lot of you might actually know Catherine. She was or know of her. She was the media spokesperson in British Columbia for the RCMP during the Picton serial killing.
Okay.
And Catherine was on the news every night doing updates on what they were finding at the Picton farm and stuff. And she was my troop mate. We had gone through training together, basic training. And I hadn't seen her in a long time, but there she was in this interview in 2011. She was just so thin, and she was wearing a ball hat, and she was hunched over, and she was nothing like she had looked when I had last seen her. And so I reached out to Natalie Clancy, the lady who did the interview, and told her, like, Catherine, I know Catherine, and I have total faith in whatever she's saying is accurate and correct. And told her I said, that could be my story. I've gone through a similar experience. And Natalie wrote back and she said, Janet, I have heard from 150 RCMP officers today in response to Catherine's story. And that was it. There was a fire lit at that point. And yeah.
So was that the point where you started thinking about telling your story in a publishable form?
Kind of, yeah. It was through Natalie that a lot of us, she connected some of the women who had reached out to her, and we got connected and got talking and thought there must be some recourse. This is Canada. There should be something that can hold these people accountable. So that's when we got involved with the civil lawyers and to see if we had any route through the civil court system. And we did. We made contact with David Klein and another lawyer in Ontario. And yeah, we started. David Klein, he contacted me and he asked if I had any evidence of any of the things that I had experienced. And the next day I went to Staples and I photocopied about 400 pages and I couriered it off to him, and I thought that'll get you started. So then they came back and asked me if I'd be the plaintiff in this lawsuit, and absolutely, because I had lost everything. I'd lost my career, my marriage, my kids were suffering, my financial security was suffering. I couldn't, like I just didn't know what to do. So the only thing to do was fight.
So how many women signed on at the beginning of the lawsuit, of the class action suit?
Well, in hindsight, it's kind of funny because there was about 20 of us, and we were like, oh man, this is huge. There's 20 of us. We thought we were the only one, but there's 20. And then as the court process went, more and more women reached out. And then after 4 years of back and forth and court appearances, a settlement was proposed, and there were settlement talks. And on the day of the announcement of the settlement, there was 500 women that had contacted the lawyers. And they thought that it would double. They thought that number, usually class actions, when there's an announcement of a settlement, the numbers double, because those who are hesitant then feel confident enough to go forward, because they know, that there's some security there. And yeah, 3,200 women came forward. So it more than tripled.
These are all former employees of the RCMP women officers. So that must be a significant portion of the women who had served as RCMP officers.
Well, yeah, it was again a mix of RCMP officers, the civilian members, and the municipal staff people who have been support staff all across Canada in these detachments. So yeah, we figured out that it was about 1 in 4 of every woman who had ever worked for the RCMP.
And the terms of the settlement, so there was a fairly significant financial settlement, or at least for the collectivity.
Yeah, everyone, they appointed an adjudicator to the case, retired Chief Justice Bastarash, and he basically went through every single case and adjudicated it. Everyone who put in a claim had to put in a claim submission, and he went through it and interviewed. Everyone was categorized from 1 to 6, and depending on what number they were in that order, that was the level of compensation they received.
So in addition to this, and we'll come back to his report in a minute, in addition to this, you wrote a book about your experience. Can you tell us about that and how you came to do that?
Well, when I left the RCMP, in the mail one day, I got an exit interview, and it was just like a 3 or 4 page thing that you handwrite and fill in, and it's done anonymously. So I filled it out, and I was furious, and I mailed it off, and I never thought anything about it until the class action was launched. And then I wished I had kept a copy of this handwritten exit interview. So I contacted Ottawa and found where I needed to go, and I asked if I could have a copy of it. And the guy called me back, and he said, well, I'd like to, but they're all anonymous, and is there anything about yours that would make it different, stick out from the many others we have? I said, it's handwritten, it's about 7 pages long, and I was pissed off. So the next day I got a call saying he had found it. And so he scanned it and he emailed it to me. And in that exit interview, I told them I was going to write a book. One day I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to out all this. And so in 2012, when the lawsuit was launched, my girls and I moved back to Newfoundland, just to kind of get away from Nanaimo and get away from all that had happened, and reset ourselves. And it was there that I contacted a publishing company and did a small submission to them about what was going on, and they signed a contract, and the next year the book was published. So it was a long winter writing that book, and a very difficult winter revisiting a lot of stuff, but it was well worth it.
So can you share with us the title of the book, and people may want to be able to get it from their local bookstore?
Oh yeah, the title is called No One to Tell: Breaking My Silence on Life in the RCMP. And that title was actually chosen by my editor, because I hadn't even thought of a title, and she was reading it, and she said and editing as I went, and she said the one thing that just kept coming back to her, that there was no one to tell.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, that's
well, I mean, there was no one to tell, and also apparently there was no protection for someone who was speaking up for a whistleblower.
No, because as soon as I did, I was I was immediately transferred punitively, I felt, away from, and they knew what they were going to do when they transferred me to the Lower Mainland. They knew it would either wreck my marriage or wreck my career, and it did both.
Because there are countries in the world that have good whistleblower protection legislation where had the RCMP or its equivalent done it in those countries, there would have been a process by which you could have gone and gotten protection and remedy for what they had done. But the Canadian legislation really isn't worth the paper it's written on, as you probably discovered. So Mr. Justice Basharais wrote a report, I think it was what, in 2019, after his review of this, as I recall. I mean, I wrote down the title here. It's Broken Lives, Broken Dreams, the Devastating Effects of Sexual Harassment on Women in the RCMP. Was it powerful in the way its title seems to suggest?
I'm going to cry now, because just before that was released, the lawyers contacted me and they asked me if I wanted a copy of it to read through, because as soon as it was made public, the media would want to, ask me questions about it. So preemptively, they couriered over a copy of this report, and I sat and I read it, and it's over there on my table, and it's very tear-stained as I read through, because even I had heard a lot of these women's stories, and I knew it was big, but I didn't know how devastating it was. And they said, Brenda Lucky asked us if you would be okay with her calling you when this report comes out to talk to you about it and how you feel about it. And so I said, sure, I'm willing to talk. So I steeled myself for that phone call, and I have severe PTSD, which is why I cry a lot. And I don't want to cry. I don't want to be weak. I just want to have a conversation with this woman. So I waited and I waited and I waited, and Christmas came and Christmas passed and the new year came, and the report had come out in, I believe it was October, November, and nothing. She never ever called. She never reached out, nothing. So January, one day I wrote one hell of a message to her. I emailed her and I said, if you haven't reached out now, don't bother. Don't bother. And that was it. So yeah, I had no idea that there had been 130 women raped by RCMP officers. None of those rapes have ever been investigated.
Oh my God.
The RCMP says that the women were allowed to make their claims anonymously, which they were. It was part of the settlement that they could do that anonymously for their own protection as well. And I don't know. They say that unless these women now go to the RCMP and make a formal complaint saying I was raped by a member of the RCMP, they don't know who to investigate. That's their story. They don't know who to investigate because no one has reported those crimes to them, which I think shows just how broken the system is and how broken it still is. Because if they had stepped in and started making some very, very important structural changes, these women might have the faith to report their rapes, but they haven't. Nobody has.
But it's a strange system, isn't it? Where if you have an allegation of a crime against members of an organization, it's not just one bad apple, but obviously systemic in the organization. If there were 3,200 women who signed on to the settlement, isn't it strange that they would go to the very organization against whom the challenges or the complaints are made to do the investigation?
Yes, and therein lies the problem. The RCMP has known since the 80s that there's been a problem with sexual harassment and sexual misconduct, and they've hired scholar after scholar and expert to do studies on what can make the RCMP better. And all of those reports, I believe there's 17 of them now, they recommend independent oversight of the RCMP in terms of its internal misconduct. And the government and the RCMP just ignores those recommendations. None of them are ever binding. So they take them, they put them on the shelf, and they collect dust and they ignore it. And until that changes, nothing is going to change.
Well, and this is successive governments, isn't so this isn't a conservative issue or a liberal issue. They've all been equally complicit in doing nothing.
Yeah, and I think as long as the RCMP is so tightly tied to the federal government, that's going to be the way it is. You know, they investigate themselves. And I did a talk last week, and there was 100 people there, and I said, if you are all armed robbers and I gave you all your own files to investigate yourselves, how many guilty people would we have here today? You know, like, as to think that they can investigate themselves is idiotic. It is, they've showed time and time again they can't be trusted to do that. So that ability needs to be taken away from them, and it needs to be done by an external independent body.
So do you have any sense of why a government wouldn't respond? What pressure is on it? Or, I mean, this is the kind of thing that would be so obvious, it would seem to me, for a government to be outraged about and to want to take action. Why do you think it isn't? Successive governments haven't.
Well, you know, I have had the honor of working with wonderful, wonderful RCMP officers, like boots on the ground, guys that I would give my life for, and vice versa. And I know that. But the problem is with management, and management is such a closed little group. They determine who gets promoted into their ranks. They determine who does these investigations. They can make these investigations go away. And I think at some point in upper management, almost everybody has either been complicit in it, they've witnessed it, or they've had some hand in covering it up. And that's why they will not bring in independent eyes, because I can guarantee you the problem in the RCMP isn't the members that come to the calls when you need them. They're good people. The management, on the other hand, they've either, like I said, they've been part of covering it up, or they've been part of the problem. And that's why they keep fighting this. So that's why it needs to be legislated. It needs to be legislated in Canada, independent investigative oversight.
I'm sure what's so hard for you is all you've done. You exposed at a great personal cost to yourself. You fought it for a decade now, and to see so little happen. And yet, without what you've done and the other women who've come forward, there would be no chance whatsoever to get something done about it. I mean, when this series is about why whistleblowers matter. With the lack of protection for whistleblowers in this country, people end up sacrificing themselves if they speak up and are vilified and denigrated for it. And yet there's no assurance that anything's going to come of it. And yet, without speaking up, there'd be no possibility of anything being done.
Yeah.
So do you have some optimism that there could be a way? I mean, you've talked about one measure that would make a difference, and that would be an independent oversight of the RCMP. I think this government already has a body that has oversight over CSIS. And don't they have legislation where they're looking at an oversight body for the Canada Border Service Agency?
Yes, there's a new bill was introduced for first reading in the spring, Bill C-20. And that's hinting towards independent oversight, and we need to get that through to second reading and have a go-to committee coming up in the fall. And we're trying to do that. A group of us have joined forces to put some pressure on some politicians to do that. But the RCMP introduced, I don't know what you call it, not legislation, but it is now punishable by dismissal to speak out negatively publicly about the RCMP. So if you are in the organization and you speak out publicly, they can dismiss you. So that's why you don't hear of a lot of current members complaining. We hear them. They of our little group of victims of this, we've had a number of people reach out to us, even like almost once a week, one of us will hear from somebody who's going through harassment and bullying in the RCMP, and they have no one to tell. It's the same. And if they speak out publicly, they can be fired for that. So then the RCMP says, oh, well, you know, our complaints of harassment have gone down. It's like, yeah, I guess they have, because now you can fire people for that, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah, it seems to go from bad to worse sometimes, you know, but you got to remain optimistic, because something's got to give at some point.
Well, I mean, you doing what you're doing and your colleagues doing what they're doing by speaking out is the only basis on which there's any hope of something being done. The frustration with getting the government to legislate on this, but you're just mentioning that you've taken some actions independently of government. Can you tell us about you said you're bringing a group together. Could you share with our listeners and the people who will view this video afterwards a little bit about your group and how they might get in touch with you were they wishing to do so?
Oh yeah, last year during the election, actually, I'm a news junkie, so I was watching the news and I saw Olivia Chow from the Institute for Change Leaders do an interview regarding the upcoming election. And I was very interested in that. So I looked up the Institute and I reached out just in the general ask a question section and said, you know, if you're ever doing a course on whistleblowing or speaking out and you need a speaker or someone to tell a lived experience, you know, I'm here. And I got a call from her, and together over the course of last year, we got a group of us together. We all met through court and through the class action process, and we actually formed a not-for-profit association called Breaking Barriers Together Association. And what our goal is to just bombard Canadians with information about where their tax dollar is going, hundreds of millions of dollars, tax dollars going to pay out for our CMP misconduct while they do nothing to make it better. So in light of, you know, the Nova Scotia mass shooting and in light of other tragedies across Canada, we're asking Canadians, like, where do you want your tax dollar spent? Do you want it spent for the government to pay out continuously for this misconduct? Or do you want it put into a healthy police force where your members are, you know, there's adequate members, there's adequate training, there's adequate, you know, equipment, you know, all these things are lacking because the RCMP is so miserably managed, and it needs to become a voting issue. I think, you know, Canadians are angry now that $8 million were paid out by Hockey Canada. Well, 125 million was paid because of misconduct in their police force. And from our class action, there was two more. There's a $1.2 billion lawsuit for generalized harassment and bullying, which was certified officially just last week. It was in the news that it was certified and moving forward. So this is not just a women's issue. This is going to give all the men in the RCMP who've been bullied and harassed and abused their voice. And then there's another one for racism that is currently in the court system. So
again, the name of the group is Breaking Barriers Together. Is that right?
Yeah, Breaking Barriers Together Association. We have a website. We're getting it up and running. So it's a process. It's a work in progress, but we do have a website.
People could Google Breaking Barriers Together to find you.
Breaking Barriers Together Association, and they'll find it. Yeah. So they can look at our website. We've lost some very wonderful people along the way. My other troop mate, Krista Carlay, she was very outspoken as well about the harassment and bullying, and she took her life in 2018, and that just gutted us because it was so hard to lose her. And you know, we've lost Ron Francis, the man who his mental health was failing, and he was trying to make a statement. He's the guy that was in the news for smoking his prescribed marijuana and his red surge, and the RCMP treated him terribly, and he took his life. And then Pierre Lemaitre, the media spokesperson after Catherine Galliford. Pierre was the spokesperson for the airport tasering in Vancouver, and he did his, you know, his PR stuff the way he was told. And then when the video came out showing that the RCMP version of events was not accurate, they kind of threw him under the bus and said that he had said things that he wasn't supposed to have said, and that was absolutely inaccurate. And Pierre took his life, and it's just, we've lost some incredible people along the way.
Well, why don't we turn to the audience and see if there are any questions for you, if that's okay. Ange, could you share the first question that's come in?
Yeah, and I do want to remind attendees that you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to ask a question. The first question is from Larry, and Larry says, Ms. Merlo, in your opinion, do you care to comment if there is any connection between the Rcmp culture that led to the massive gender violence and the Rcmp failings in the recent Nova Scotia mass murder?
I think that's a tough one, because I feel nothing but sympathy for boots on the ground officers that had to deal with that tragedy and what they're dealing with as a result. I think in the Mass Casualty Commission, you can see where there's problems. You know, Brenda Lucky says she doesn't get involved. She watches everything from 10,000 feet up, and she doesn't get into the weeds of how the organization is run. And that's pretty sad that a leader distanced themselves. And, you know, recordings that would prove political interference have gone missing. And so at a management level, I think, yeah, I don't know if it was gender related, all that stuff, but it's sad nonetheless. You know, I just don't know.
Okay, Ange, do you have another question?
Yeah, the next question is from David, and David asks Janet, do you believe that women who are experiencing harassment in the Rcmp today are likely to discuss this with each other, unlike in your day?
They might be talking about it more amongst their own ranks than we ever did. We were kind of scared into silence, but I think with you know, the same issues coming out in the Canadian military, and it's being talked about more and it's accepted more. So I think maybe within their ranks they're reaching out to us for sure to ask for help. And you know, we would love to help, and we're trying to help, but we're not there anymore. We have no power, and those in power choose to ignore it. So, and they can't speak out publicly because then they could be fired. So yeah, they might, hopefully they're talking and supporting each other. I'd like to think they are.
Ange, another question?
Yeah, the next one from Rosemary. Rosemary is asking does the Rcmp have a union and a collective agreement?
Yes, the Rcmp had to fight for years in court to win the right to form a union, and that was because the Rcmp Act had a clause in it that wouldn't allow them to do that. So they won that right in, I believe it was 2015. And then they had two groups that were vying to be the union. So the membership got to vote, and they did vote in the National Police Federation, the NPF, and they've been the union. I think they signed their first contract in 2021. I think the problem with the union, though, is that they're new and they have so many pressing issues like that need to be dealt with yesterday. And those are staffing and equipment and training and all the frontline things. And you know, harassment and bullying is a big issue as well, but I think they're just getting off the ground, and they've got a lot of things on their plate to deal with.
Yes, when there's problems with management, I guess it manifests itself in many different ways, doesn't it?
Absolutely. One of my last annual assessments, my harassing supervisor said, Merlo, get in here. We got to get this thing done. So I went in his office and he had a questionnaire. He got so far down, and this was back in probably 2007. And he said, where do you see yourself in 5 years, Merlo? And I said, shop steward. And he kicked me out of his office. He just said, get out of my office. We're done. But yeah, they didn't want a union in place because, you know, they had years of getting away with treating us the way they did. So yeah.
Okay. Ange, do you have another question?
Yeah, the next question is from Michelle. Michelle says, thank you for your service and for speaking out. Can you tell us about the impact on your children seeing you go through such unfair treatment by the RCMP?
Well, I have two daughters, and when I got pregnant with the first daughter, they yelled and screamed and told me to get my priorities straight, and were very cruel about it. So the girls are 5 years apart because I wouldn't have a second child until a different person was running that part of the detachment, someone that was a little more understanding of women having children in the 90s. But you know, they were teenagers when all this was happening, and they saw how broken I was. They went through the divorce. People say, you know, have your girls read your book? And I said, probably not, because they've lived my book. You know, they'll probably read it when they're older, but they've lived it. They saw, you know, they saw how crippling it can be to be mistreated at work. And I think from that, they will be stronger workers themselves. You know, they have a line that they know that if it's crossed, they need to address it at whatever cost in their workplace. And they're both done post-secondary and out working now. So hopefully life will be a little easier for them. Thank goodness they didn't choose policing. So yeah, they suffer some insecurities and some, you know, maybe a little PTSD themselves after watching what happened to our family. And yeah, they suffer some consequences for sure.
Ange, do you have another question?
Yeah, the next one is from Sandy. Sandy asks, what else can we do to help make a difference on these issues?
Well, we had when we formed our not-for-profit last year, we actually had a petition in Parliament for independent oversight of the RCMP, and that actually expired on September 22nd. So we've got to get back on that. But just, you know, start asking some municipal elections, start asking your municipal candidates, do you have RCMP policing your municipality, and where do you want your tax dollars spent? Do you want it spent to support this broken system, or do you want it made better? You know, and ask, you know, ask politicians. Sign, when we get another petition going, we'll put it up on our website. You know, write your MPs, write anyone you can think of, and let them know that it's important to you, because we need Canadians' voices. We've tried, we've done it internally, we've gone to court, we won in court, we got all these promises from the government, and they just put it on the shelf and ignore it after the fact. And here we are, you know, 2016, we're 7 years now out from the announcement of the settlement, and we still have people contacting us that are in hell in that organization. So yeah, anything you can do, write letters, sign petitions, you know, contact your local municipality, ask them where they want their policing dollar spent.
So any more questions, Ange?
Yeah, the next one is a question from Judy. And Judy asks, we've heard a lot about defunding the police. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have the thought that we need to fund the police, but there needs to be oversight to see where that funding is going. You know, are they, you know, are the ones at the top making huge bonuses every year? Are they getting bonuses from your policing dollar? You know, is it spent to cover up misconduct? I think if anything, the police need to be funded in terms of, you know, having access to mental health professionals and social workers and people that if you go to a call at night and you need those people, they're there, you know, and they're trained and they're ready to go. You need members that are rested and supported and healthy, and that come to your call. When you call 911, you need them there, and you need them engaged, and you need them healthy. And you know, you report a rape, and the police officer that comes to take your complaint might have been raped themselves by a coworker, you know, and or or they have raped a coworker. So how are they going, you know, and you look at the sociological side of that from the Picton serial killing, you know, if people aren't respected and they're not listened to, and there's that culture of just, oh yeah, you know, rape culture, and it's all accepted. If they're raping their coworkers, how do you think they're going to deal with a complaint of sexual assault in the community? You know, I think it's time to fund them adequately, but watch where that money is going, because it's going into the wrong pockets. I can guarantee you that.
Ange?
Yeah, the next question, I think this is kind of carries on from what you were just talking about, is from Barbara. And Barbara says, thank you for your participation in this series and for sharing your shocking experiences. I'm wondering if you were able to talk about any effects of the RCMP management culture on members of the public who have been mistreated at the hands of RCMP members. I'm wondering if you have been involved in discussions about this matter.
I watch sometimes the stories on the news and how everybody now has cameras and they're videotaping, and they call the police and they expect the police to be there. Like I said, 100% engaged, doing everything accurate 100% of the time. And if not, they're very critical. And what I would like to see is people understand where those who those officers are working for and what kind of environment they're working, and learn a backstory before they get too critical, because it's not the boots on the ground officers that needs to be dealt with here. It's the management of the force. And yeah, I can imagine that, you know, over the years when those people who are in management now were out policing, when they were the boots on the ground moving up through the system, I can guarantee you there was people in the public who were treated unfairly. I can tell you stories about that, you know. I think people need to just broaden their horizon a little bit and just see where it's all coming from. And yeah, it's sad. It's sad to see the officers that are going through the most scrutiny are the boots on the ground people who are out there trying to serve and protect, and while the management just walks away unscathed from all this misconduct.
I think you have one more question, Ange.
I do. This is from Ian, and Ian asks, do you think these abuses could be mitigated at the hiring stage by selecting future RCMP members more carefully? Or is it so ingrained into the culture that even good people get turned? I'm shocked by the mobbing you faced.
I think they hire the right people, but the problem is they don't promote the right people. The ones in management are covering up wrongdoing, and they're writing these checks to people that they've broken, and that's just the way they operate. And I think the problem is that barrier between they criticize me. The one criticism I ever had in an annual assessment was they said I wasn't ambitious enough because I hadn't written the promotional test. And I wrote a rebuttal to that, and I said that I didn't want to work on a management team that treated people the way they did. And I had no aspirations to be promoted within the RCMP. I liked working in the community. I did policing to serve and protect the community, not to be a manager, especially not in that organization. And yeah, I think that's where it needs, you know, if there was some kind of independent oversight that got rid of all the toxic people at the top, then the good people that try to get promoted, that would do the change that the RCMP needs, they would be able to move up the ranks. They can still keep hiring people and, you know, and vetting people, but I think it's that promotional process, that paramilitary structure that's not working, and that leads to bad management.
I think one of the times we talked, Janet, you had mentioned there seems to be also withdrawal from some of the community engagement that, in other words, are moving exactly in the opposite direction that they should. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's lost in policing these days is the connection with the community. Like when I was a kid and the new police officer came to my hometown, you know, they were a ball coach, or they were in, you know, they were involved in the community, and you got to see that other side of them, and it made them more human. And over the years, the RCMP have dropped a lot of the programs that they had, like the auxiliary program. We had members of the community that were trained to a certain degree, and they would come in and ride with us on weekends, and they were an extra set of eyes in the car. They could help us with our paperwork. The community was engaged. They got to see what we did on a daily basis, and they kind of protected us too, because we liked the auxiliaries, because when the town chiropractor was sitting in the office dressed in a police uniform on a Friday night to ride along with one of us, the boss wasn't so anxious to grab your boobs as he walked by. You know, like that we had protection when there was a member of the public in the police station. They were on their best behavior all the time. And as soon as that program was gone, we were fair game. There was no one, there was no eyes. And, you know, neighborhood watch, community watch. We used to do the child find programs. We'd go around fingerprinting children in case they ever went missing. You'd have that record, you know, and all those community things. And if an independent oversight body was some way community based, I think it would break that barrier of us and them. And it takes a village. You can't have a community well policed when the RCMP, there's no transparency, there's no communication, there's no community involvement. I think that's the way to get back. I think so.
Okay, Ange, do you have another question?
Yeah, I do. The next question is from Leanne. And they say, I'm a former firefighter who spoke out within the fire service in Halifax. I spent 12 years of my life fighting for my rights as a woman. The systemic issues that I and other women went through are identical to policing. I have no faith that things will change anytime soon. All the work that I have done to bring to light that the abuses have done no change within the service. How do I keep going, and how did you keep going?
You know, I keep going because I think of all my friends who have sons and daughters who one day want to be police officers. And I just have that, I have that stubbornness that I want to leave things better for them than it was for me. And yeah, there's been days, even a couple of weeks ago, I just thought, what the hell am I doing? I should just be done. Never watch news again, never do this. But you know, I look at the future and the young people coming up, and I think, God, we need to change it for them. You know, if there was a mass casualty event in your town today, do you have the faith that your police and your first responders, your fire, your ambulance, do you think they're all equipped and ready to go in the event something happens? And I think if we all collectively reflect on that, we'll realize that there's a lot of work that needs done. And the first part of it is getting rid of this misconduct, getting rid of the bad apples. I hate that term. They're rapists and they're stalkers, and they have assaulted people, and they've stolen from Canadians. So bad apples is not the right word, but there needs to be something to fix that before, because our communities are suffering. So that's why I keep doing it, because I just can't let it go. It's too important.
Ange, another question?
Yeah, the next question is from Mary. And Mary says, I experienced similar years-long mistreatment from my organization, and I'm now very involved in representing employees who are going through similar workplace harassment, violence, and discrimination. I challenge the accountability to policies and how they investigate internally. How best can I support these employees when they come to me for help?
I think the biggest thing is just to listen and support them. And if they don't come back, if you hear, one thing I've learned through this whole thing, that harassment in an organization is like is as simple as having a mouse in your house. They say if you see a mouse in your house, there's probably a half dozen more in the walls. If you have a victim of harassment in your workplace, I can guarantee you there's a half a dozen more. And so keep that communication with that person open, because you might be the first person that person opens up to, and that's the hardest thing to do. To do that initial, it's just like a child telling an adult the first time that someone has done something to them. That first initial disclosure is a really difficult one. So stay in touch with that person and encourage them to talk amongst themselves, talk to coworkers, because it might be happening, and then you talk to one person and the next day you've got 3 of them at your door, and the 3 turns to 5, and together then, hopefully strength in numbers will send you in the direction where you might be able to make some change.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to end our conversation, Janet. I can't tell you what an honor it's been to have you on this in this conversation, to just share your story. I know how hard it is for you. I know how courageous you've had to be. But I hope you take some comfort in realizing that the possibility of bringing about a change is only because of you and some of your other colleagues who've spoken up, and Canada will be a better place for what you've done. So thank you very much for being with us, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.